If you go to the main entrance of Westminster Abbey in London, just inside the door there, you'll find a lone grave. This is, of course, the grave of the unknown British warrior from the First World War. It's a symbol. It represents all of those who fell during the Great War. During the First World War, 880,000 British and Dominion troops were killed. Over half of them have no known grave, their bodies lost or simply unidentifiable. Can you imagine the impact on their families back home? Not only have they lost a loved one, they have no grave to visit, no place to grieve. The idea for the unknown warrior was conceived by the Reverend David Railton way back in 1916 when he was serving in the British Army as a padre. He was in a rest area near Armentières in France, and at the back of the building where he was staying there was the grave of an unknown British warrior, member of the Black Watch. Reverend Railton had served in the Territorial Army before the war in a Highland regiment, so this really got to him. And he thought, wouldn't it be a great idea if after the war we took one of our unknown warriors home and buried him back in Britain? He wrote to the High Command, but he never got a reply. But after the war, this was still bugging him, knowing how many men were out there unknown. And his wife suggested, well, why don't you write to the Dean of Westminster Abbey in London, the Right Reverend Herbert Ryle? And he actually thought the idea was great, and he picked up the torch, and it was he who built up the momentum, writing to all of the well-known people, the important people in the land. So, on the 7th of November 1920, 4 separate burial parties were sent out into the main battlefields of the Western Front: Ypres, the Aisne, Arras, and of course the Somme. And each one exhumes a body, has to be well salted down so that it cannot be recognised only as an unknown British soldier. They're transported by motor ambulance to General Headquarters at St Paul. The burial parties were then dismissed and the bodies were placed on stretchers inside a makeshift chapel, and each body was covered with a Union flag. 2 officers then, Brigadier General Wyatt and Colonel Gell, were taken into the room, and they quickly but randomly and reverently chose one of the bodies. The 3 that were not chosen were taken outside and reburied, but the unknown soldier that had been chosen was placed inside a temporary coffin. We call him Unknown Warrior. You see, he may have been an airman. He could have been a sailor fighting with the naval divisions on land. It's the unknown British warrior. At Boulogne, as the coffin of the unknown warrior was loaded onto HMS Verdun, Marshal Foch, leader of the French armed forces, saluted the coffin. On the journey across, HMS Verdun and escorts made their way back towards Dover. And as HMS Verdun emerges out of the mist of the channel, the fog, it's challenged. "Who are you?" And HMS Verdun replies, "HMS Verdun, escorts, and Britain's unknown son." Wow. All the quaysides, the harbour, everywhere in Dover was packed full of people, silent, waiting to get a glimpse of the coffin. So the coffin was disembarked from HMS Verdun and placed in a passenger luggage goods van on a train. Now the railway workers painted the roof of this goods van white so people could recognise it on its journey through to London. At every station, military bands played sombre music. Guards of honour had been formed, and across every footbridge and along every platform and alongside the tracks where people could stand, the crowds had gathered. The back doors of houses that opened out onto the railway were open and lights shone across their gardens. People stood, silent, watching. When he arrives at Victoria, people are so eager to see the coffin, they even buy train tickets to try and get onto the platform to catch a glimpse. However, the carriage was taken to platform 8
which is the Buckingham Palace Road entrance to the Victoria Station, and there it will remain overnight under strict honour guard.
It's the morning of the 11th of November 1920. The casket of the unknown warrior is transferred from the train and fastened to a gun carriage, which will be pulled by 6 black horses of the Royal Horse Artillery. The procession will make its way to the cenotaph, which is the new memorial for the nation's war dead in London. The King is stood to one side, waiting for the procession to arrive.
At 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1920, the bells of Big Ben sound, and on the 11th chime, the King presses a button and the Union flags, both of them, fall to the ground. Now the parade forms up. The King, in a Field Marshal's uniform, falls in behind the unknown warrior. Orders are barked, and the parade makes its way to Westminster Abbey. Thousands of people, soldiers in uniform, veterans, medals gleaming, lined the route and watched as the unknown warrior trundled by on its way to Westminster Abbey, where, on arrival, he was carried feet first through the door, where he will be laid to rest amongst our kings and queens. Once the funeral was over and all the dignitaries had gone home, a temporary cover was put on the grave so that people could come and view. A silent, sobbing queue wound around London. Black-clad mothers, orphans, widows carried lilies, the scent of which simply filled the air as they shuffled to view the grave of our unknown fallen son.
People travelled from all over Britain and even farther afield to walk past the tomb of the unknown warrior. And in fact, a police officer who was on duty when the public were allowed in, he recalled how he'd met an elderly lady who'd travelled down from the north of Scotland. And I'll tell you, in those days, that was a heck of a journey. In her hands, she had a posy of wilted flowers. And the police officer spoke to her and she explained that these flowers were from her garden. Her son had been killed early on in the war, and the flowers were from his flower bed. She says he planted these flowers when he was but 6 years of age. The tomb of the unknown warrior is still there at the entrance to Westminster Abbey, and thousands upon thousands of people visit it every year. But it no longer just represents the dead of the Great War. It represents those who were killed in the Second World War, the Korean War, and all of the conflicts ever since. So do me a favour. If ever you visit London, pay him a visit. Have a moment of reflection, because now you know what it really stands for.